Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is a Common Futures Conversations webinar on the just green transition. My name is Aston Horton, and I'm a member of the CFC community. I'm from the US, but dual citizen with the UK and currently based in France, studying a master's in global energy transition and governance. Common Futures Conversations is a Chatham House centenary project centered on bringing together young people from Africa and Europe to develop their knowledge of the most pressing current issues. The aim is to give young people a seat at the table in important policy discussions. The CFC community conducts 3-month policy design cycles where we engage with special topics or specific topics and experts to develop our knowledge of the policy area before writing our own policy solutions to address challenges and opportunities that we have identified. This event that we're hosting right now is the culmination of the community's engagement with the just green energy transition. This was a particularly timely discussion following COP28 in the global stocktake, which recognized that fossil fuels are causing global warming despite decades of warnings from scientists. The CFC community is keen to keep this discussion moving forward and help steer policy in a way that will help the world achieve an energy transition that is sustainable and just. I would like to extend a special welcome to members of the Common Futures Conversation community, as well as Chatham House members who are joining us for this event. Would also like to welcome everyone else throughout our external communities who are joining us for this event, or joining us today. Thank you for your participation. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. First of all, this event is being recorded and is not being held under the Chatham House rule. This event is a webinar and all attendees will be muted throughout, but you will be able to use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the event. At the end, we'll have a dedicated QA time, at which point you may raise your hand if you would like to ask a question out loud. If you are selected to ask a question, you will be granted the ability to unmute yourself. We will try to get as many questions as possible at the end of the event. I'll briefly introduce our esteemed speaker before handing it over to him for his opening remarks. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denison University that is currently on leave, and he is the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He is also a member of the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, an expert group member with the International Task Force, and serves as the senior advisor with PowerShift Africa, which is why he is currently based in Addis Ababa. He has recently served as Undersecretary General for Financing for Development at the Organization of Southern Cooperation in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Dr. Kaboub is an expert on designing public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the Global South, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. His recent work focuses on just transition, climate finance, and transforming the global trade, finance, and investment architecture. His most recent co-authored publication is Just Transition, a climate, energy, and development vision for Africa. He is currently based in Nairobi, Kenya, where he is working on climate finance and development policies now. Welcome, Dr. Kaboub. Over to you.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you're following us from. Thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation. So I'll limit my remarks to about 10 to 15 minutes. And I'll focus on our theme today, which is just transition. And I'll start by highlighting this report that you just mentioned, Aston, which we will drop in the chat for the participants. It's called the Just Transition Report, and it's published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which was a group of experts convened by Dr. Yuba Sikona, who's the former vice chair of the IPCC from Mali. And what we try to do in this report is put forward a long-term, coherent, comprehensive vision that simultaneously links climate development and energy policies. And it's written from an African perspective, but you could easily make the argument that what we're presenting really represents a global South perspective, broadly speaking. And one of the phrases I usually use to describe what we try to deliver in that report is the following, which is we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And what I mean by that is that the global South in general, and Africa in particular, has been assigned a particular role in the global economy during colonial times. And that role has been reinforced in the post-colonial era. And what we argue is that we cannot move forward under a just transition framework if we keep the global South, and Africa in particular, playing that particular colonial role. So that role can be summarized in 3 major points. Number one, we were supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output in our large consumer market, industrial output from the global north. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north is outsourced to us under the labor of development and cooperation and job creation. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us at the bottom of the global value chain permanently. So these three colonial roles, you can clearly, review the history of the last 60 to 70 years and recognize that Africa continues to play that role. And our argument is that a just transition cannot keep the same colonial structures, extractive structures. And I'll give you one data point to illustrate how bad this extractive system is. If you divide the world into global north and global south and net out all global financial transactions, that is foreign direct investment, exports, imports, remittances from workers, even illicit financial flows, interest payment, even debt relief and climate finance included, all financial flows, the net amount, the last data point we have is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. That is money moving in the wrong direction. Now put that number side by side with all of our great efforts on the climate finance front. You have $100 billion promised, from more than 15 years ago and never delivered. And whatever was delivered was loans, actually, 80% of it was loans. Then you have the Green Climate Fund. The last replenishment of the Green Climate Fund barely reached $12 billion. And then more recently, you have, of course, the Loss and Damage Fund, which was created at COP28 in Dubai, and the pledges that we have are $700 million with an M, not with a B, not with a T. So at that rate, we're not going to decarbonize anything, and we're not going to transform the colonial role and the extractive nature of the global economic architecture. So when I say global economic architecture, it's the financial architecture, that's the World Bank and the IMF. It's the international trade and investment architecture, that's the WTO primarily. And it's the international taxation architecture, which for a long time has been in the hands of the OECD countries until last November with the UN vote to move the tax system finally into a US tax convention with one country, one vote. So that's the global economic architecture that was not designed by us, not designed for us. So why are we surprised when we see a global economic architecture that's producing colonial extractive results? So that transformation of the global economic architecture is a prerequisite for a just transition. And then I'll zoom in very quickly on the African continent and zoom in on particular structures, three major structural deficiencies that must be transformed in the process of a just transition and the process of decarbonization. So when you look at that $2 trillion number of money flowing in the wrong direction, that extraction of wealth from the global south, you zoom in and you realize that it can be traced to three major structural deficiencies. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, manufacturing deficits. There are other structures, of course, but these are the main ones. When I say energy deficits in the African continent, I actually include our biggest oil exporter on the continent, Nigeria. Nigeria today is energy insecure, energy poor. Nigeria today imports 100% of its gasoline, 100%. Our second largest exporter of oil on the continent, Angola, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. And that is not by accident, that is by design. Number two, when I say food deficits, according to the latest report from UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, Africa today imports 85% of its food, when less than 100 years ago, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. How did that happen? Again, not by accident, by design. It's the rules of international trade that produced heavy agricultural subsidies in a few countries in the global north, and therefore forced our farmers, it's essentially out of competition when it comes to producing the core food items, the core food sovereignty items, wheat, rice, corn, barley, and so on. So we end up with the system where we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. I'll give you one quick example to illustrate. Ethiopia today is a country that has, I think, the third largest export item is flowers, cut flowers, cash crops, essentially, flowers for Valentine's. At the same time, Ethiopia today has 20 million people who are dependent on food aid from abroad. And it's not unique to Ethiopia, of course. So the transformation of the agricultural system to force us to specialize in cash crop production, coffee, tea, tobacco, fruits, leafy greens, and cut flowers for exports. And we depend heavily on our imports of wheat, rice, corn, and so on. So that's the food deficit. Number three, manufacturing deficits, whereby the kind of manufacturing that we were allowed to have in Africa and the global south is the kind, and I underline allowed to have. We can come back to that in the Q&A session. Is the kind of manufacturing where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, we have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, and we even have to import the packaging. So you end up with an industrial manufacturing base that exports low value added content and import high value added content. So that's a structural trap. So you could double, triple, quadruple your exports, you're still locked at the bottom of the global value chain. So take these three structural deficits, food deficits, energy deficits, and of course, no country can function without food, without energy, right? Food deficits, energy deficits, and manufacturing deficits. You have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade, and a structural trade deficit weakens the value of your currency relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. With the weaker currency, anything I import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, you import it at a premium, you import it at a higher real cost. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of the economy, food, fuel, and so on. So that means our governments immediately have to move into a defensive mode, looking for immediate band-aid solutions to protect the most vulnerable from this imported inflation. So what do? We subsidize food, we subsidize fuel, and that is a necessary immediate band-aid solution, but it can't be sustained for 70, 80 years. Number two, our governments also ask their central banks to please do your best to stabilize the exchange rate, defend the exchange rate, stop the bleeding, essentially. And the band-aid solution that central bankers do is borrow more dollars. And that starts to feed into the external debt cycle. And as soon as you have external debt, you completely rewire your economy to prioritize economic activity that will allow you to earn dollars and euros as quickly as possible. And hence the extractivism starts to accelerate because that's the fastest way to do it. And you start neglecting the foundations of economic development and prosperity, health, education, infrastructure, and so on. Now, the good news about the structural deficiencies, once we've identified them, is that the solution is right there, staring us at the face. The solution is to invest in food sovereignty and agroecology. The solution is to invest in renewable energy sovereignty, which is our biggest potential, according to the International Energy Agency. Africa, by 2040, that's the day after tomorrow on the clock, by 2040, with existing technology, not with future innovation, can produce 1,000 times its energy needs. 1,000 times. So that is transforming the continent into not just an energy powerhouse, but an economic global powerhouse. And number three, strategic investments in a different kind of manufacturing base. That is Pan-African industrialization to produce high value-added content, not low value-added content. Starting with basic priorities. We don't want to manufacture everything. We want to manufacture the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with producing the renewable energy infrastructure, using the strategic minerals that we have on the continent, using the economies of scale that we have on the continent to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure, to deliver electricity to the 650 million people who have no access to electricity today, not to prioritize exporting green electricity to Europe. Of course, we can export the surplus. Number two, manufacturing and deploying clean cooking infrastructure for the almost 1 billion people who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure. Of course, that's mostly women and children. And number three, manufacturing and deploying the clean transportation infrastructure to link our economy, to build the foundations of the logistics of transportation. Of course, we're not talking about everybody with their Tesla battery attached to their back. We're talking about public transportation, high-speed rail. That's the potential that we have, again, on this continent. So the good news about these structural transformation type of solutions, they're not only solutions to the external debt trap, they're not only a solution to the colonial structural traps that we still struggle with, but they coincidentally happen to be climate solutions, climate adaptation solutions. So it's a win-win. So when we talk about climate finance negotiations going to COP, going to to Bonn in the next couple of weeks, we're talking about channeling climate finance strategically in transformative ways rather than channeling climate finance to continue the economic entrapment that we struggled with in the past. So the question becomes, what is this climate finance? Does it come in the form of loans or grants? Does it come in the form of transfer of life-saving technology? Or does it come in the form of foreign direct investment that is extractive? Right? These are the serious conversations we need to have when it comes to climate finance. Unfortunately, the dominant discussions about climate finance tend to be market-based solutions, de-risking foreign direct investment, and things that don't really have that transformative firepower that we're talking about, the decolonization of those economic structure that becomes the prerequisite for this decarbonization that we're seeking. And I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you again.
Cool. Thank you for those fascinating remarks, Dr. Kababu. I'm looking forward to digging into those more in the Q&A section. But in the meantime, I would now like to invite the members of the CFC community to present their policy ideas on the just green transition. These solutions were written in response to the prompt, how do we achieve an energy transition that is just and sustainable? The solutions that you will hear were the proposals that received the most votes from the CFC community. I will invite each community member to pitch their proposal for about 5 minutes before turning to our expert, Dr. Kababu, to provide brief feedback. First up, we'll hear from Daniel Gumbwa Balamwendo, a CFC member from Malawi. Daniel will be presenting his idea on climate resilience partnerships between Africa and Europe. Very topical considering the purview of our CFC community. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Aston. My name is Daniel Gumba Balamwendo from Malawi. So I will share my screen for my proposal. So given our limited time today, follow the usual protocol and dive straight into the presentation. My proposal for advancing climate resilience partnerships in Africa and Europe. As we all know, climate change is a pressing global issue that requires collective action. This proposal is built upon the successful collaboration between the African Union and the European Union COP28 Glasgow Climate Pact, aiming to further climate resilience efforts and foster community-based adaptation initiatives. Our focus is on achieving a just green transition, ensuring that benefits of climate action are equitably shared and that vulnerable communities are protected. The primary objective is to strengthen climate resilience in vulnerable regions of Africa and Europe by establishing collaborative partnerships between governments, non-governmental organizations, local communities, and international stakeholders. The proposal consists of 5 key components. Stakeholder engagement. Uniting all relevant stakeholders is crucial for sharing knowledge, expertise, and resources efficiently and effectively. For example, the African Climate Change Partnership brings together governments, NGOs, and local communities to address the climate change challenges in Africa. Point number 2, knowledge sharing and community and capacity building. Developing a comprehensive knowledge management system is essential for capturing best practices and innovative solutions from around the world. Point number 3, funding mechanism. Establishing diverse funding sources is crucial to support a wide range of climate resilience projects and initiatives. This will be achieved through the establishment of climate resilience funds and creation of public-private partnerships and the mobilization of international funding sources. Ecosystem-based adaptation. Promoting ecosystem-based adaptation is vital for protecting and restoring natural ecosystems while enhancing biodiversity. Monitoring and evaluation. Implementing a robust monitoring and evaluation system requires tracking progress and effectiveness of climate resilience projects. For example, the Malawi National Commission for Science and Technology tracks climate change impact and adaptation efforts in Malawi, while the European Environment Agency monitors climate change progress in Europe. To implement this proposal, we will initiate pilot projects like the Green Dot movement in Africa, which empowers local communities to take charge of their environment. We will organize multi-stakeholder workshops like the African Climate Change Conference, which brings together stakeholders to share knowledge and best practices. Advocate for supportive policy frameworks like the European Union Green Deal, which sets ambitious climate targets. We will also establish this by establishing knowledge exchange platforms like the Africa Europe Climate.
Hey, Daniel, sorry, it's a little hard to hear you. Sorry, when you direct a little bit more to the right, is it a little bit hard to hear you? Could you direct a bit more towards the, sorry.
All right.
Sorry, we're just having trouble hearing.
On the point number 5, scale up successful pilot projects and replicate best practices, such as the European Union Climate Resilience Infrastructure Initiative. We anticipate potential pushback from fossil fuel interests, nationalist governments, and concerns about intellectual property rights. However, we believe that collaborative efforts and community-based adaptation approaches can overcome these challenges. For example, the Africa Renewable Energy Alliance promotes renewable energy solutions, while the European Renewable Energy Federation advocates for policy support. Measuring success. We will measure success through integration of climate resilience into national policies, encouraging African and European countries to integrate climate resilience strategies into the national policies and planning frameworks. Point number 2, increase the use of renewable energy sources. By promoting the adoption of renewable energy projects such as solar and wind in both Africa and Europe, we will track the increase in renewable energy capacity installed and the reduction in reliance on fossil fuels as indicators of success. Economic impact and job creation. Creating green jobs and stimulating economic growth through climate resilience projects. In conclusion, I urge all you to join forces in advancing climate resilience partnerships in Africa and Europe. Together, we can build a more resilient and sustainable future for current and future generations. Let's learn from our existing initiatives and scale up our efforts to address climate resilience, particularly as we prepare for COP29. Thank you so much. That's all I have to present for today.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Dr. Kabub, any brief response to this policy proposal?
Thank you, Daniel. It's a very thoughtful presentation and very thoughtful framing for how cooperation between the African and European continent can really deliver that kind of change. However, my comment is on the political, I should say, geopolitical reality that we operate in, that we've operated in for a long time. And I'll give you this because this is really something that I'm very passionate about. And you underlined it, especially when you mentioned concerns about intellectual property rights. And when we talk about transfer of technology, that is really what we're talking about. Now, the way I frame it so that we go straight to, why transfer of technology, life-saving technology, right? Not all technology is so crucial to these issues. It's because we have a very simple principle, the idea that certain countries have exceeded their carbon budget and other countries, the African continent in particular, we barely, used 4%, our emissions collectively, historic emissions. less than 4% of global emissions. So there's the idea here of a climate debt, right? If you're in deficit, if you've overused your budget, right, you've exceeded your budget, you owe a debt. And that debt is owed to the countries that haven't developed, haven't exceeded their carbon budget. So the debt payment should come in the context of climate debt, should come in three forms, each according to their ability, we should say, right? So some countries can contribute in terms of debt payment by canceling debt to the African continent. Some countries have financial resources. They have fiscal policy space, so they can contribute with grants that are channeled towards that structural transformation that I talked about. And that's where cooperation comes in, of course, as you laid out in your presentation. And the third form in which you can contribute to paying this climate debt and contribute via cooperation, as you laid out, is by transfer of technology. And here's the beauty of this. The beauty of this is that the key transformative sectors that we need on the continent, let's say renewable energy to start, and clean transportation, we actually as a continent have all the raw materials needed to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure. We have the economies of scale, which is what you need for manufacturing, for industrial policy. What we lack is access to the technology to actually manufacture and deploy the solar and wind and the entire value chain. And this is coincidentally the technology that is available in Europe, right? So the partnership that you talk about has this massive potential to truly decolonize the African continent. Now, with all the work that I've done and conversations I've had, especially behind closed doors, candid conversations off the record with senior officials in the OECD, the conclusion of these conversations is the following. Nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval, because this is a question of power. It's been a question of power since colonial times, and it's even more important today. Because imagine Africa's potential to produce 1,000 times its energy needs and to make essentially OPEC look like child's play in the energy system, right? Imagine the potential economic and geopolitical influence that the African continent can have. That is a real threat to the existing hierarchy of economic and geopolitical structures. So we have to completely recognize this, put it on the table, call it out, and have candid conversations. Are we serious about a just transition? Are we serious about development in Africa? Are we serious about partnership? Because if we're not, then the only thing remaining is the continuity of this economic entrapment and extractivism. And once we have a clear conversation about what needs to be done and the kind of partnership, then your proposal is exactly what needs to happen. It's north-south, south-north, south-south cooperation on key areas that will deliver the just transition. And of course, the just energy transition on the African continent will deliver the massive energy surplus that is needed for Europe's energy security. So it's a win-win, but we have to be very clear about how we get there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaboub, and thank you, Daniel. So on to our next presentation. We have Noor Mohammed, a CFC member from Egypt, who will be discussing her policy idea on a multi-stakeholder intergenerational platform to achieve a just transition. Over to you, Noor.
Thank you so much, Aston. I'll also be sharing my screen. All right, perfect. All right, so this is the multi-stakeholder intergenerational platform for a just green transition. And before talking about what is this platform, I need at first to talk about the problem, because the first step to tackle every challenge or every to come up with a solution is to understand the problem. So let me start with the question. Please drop an emoji in the chat box or in the Q&A box if you have ever felt the frustration of not being able to reach a policymaker or a decision maker either in your country or globally, especially when it comes to issues related to the just transition or the climate crisis. I'll give you a couple of seconds. Okay, there's one. All right. I personally have felt that kind of frustration a lot, and I've shared that kind of frustration with a lot of young people, be it on the local level or the international level, because even when I escape the lack of channel when it comes to like the national level, and went to the global conferences, I found no meaningful space for young people or the people who are really affected by the climate crisis, like women, children, people of color, people of disabilities. And I've also witnessed the silos approach that is being adopted, namely the fact that we're focusing on particular groups in silos. We're not working all together to try to see how we can move forward. And then the lack of consistency, because at the end of the day, if we have good conferences or big conferences related to the climate crisis or just transition that are very far-fetched out with no consistent follow-ups, this leads to no proper action to tackle that kind of issues. And then the last part of the challenge for me was the lack of concrete action plan that includes all stakes, all the stakeholders, because action plans are there, but they are enshrined and they are not tackled, and people feel very confused, young people as well as other stakeholders, as to what is their role in the bigger scheme of lives to, you know, achieve the just green transition. And that is how I came up with the idea of the multi-stakeholder intergenerational platform for a just green transition. And this is a platform not for dialogue, because we have had a lot of dialogue, but it's a platform for action, hopefully. So what is it about? Well, basically it's a local platform that is catalyzing dialogue for action that includes multi-stakeholders that are affected by the climate crisis and just transition, as well as key decision makers who, as well as people from the private sector who have the power to, you know, mobilize and push forward the issue of just transition policies and projects. And it's being adopted from a youth sensitive as well as a gender transformative lens. So how do we do that? Well, it's basically through meaningful inclusion of the various stakeholders that I've already mentioned, including people from the brown economy, because they are also an important stakeholder when it comes to mobilizing things when it comes to the just green transition. And then also, it's a platform to provide science-based and needs-based research to also fill in those policies and projects that we need to adopt, in addition to a platform to create green standards, because without green standards, we do not understand where we are, what is greenwashing and what is not. And it's also a platform for capacity building and education. Accordingly, in this platform, we have 6 key committees or working groups. The first one is related to policy and project, and it's mainly about reviewing as well as initiating just green transition policies by different stakeholders, so that the policies that are being adopted from a bottom up as well as a top down approach. And then we have also an R&D committee, which I think is very, very also crucial when it comes to researching the impacts of the climate crisis on the local communities, as well as researching different innovations and technologies, because obviously in the global south specifically, we are lacking in that sector. As well as to, you know, have these kind of research fit into the work of the policy and project committee. And then we have the capacity building committee, and this is very also crucial because it will work on the internal structure of the platform, where the stakeholders in the platform will be having like the capacity building that they need to, you know, promote for the policy solutions that they want or the projects that they want, as well as to be able to you know, communicate with each other effectively, whether it's people of disabilities or any like people from the social spectrum. As well as an external capacity building committee, where it also focuses on the reskilling and upskilling efforts that we need, be it for brown economy employees or for young people in the educational systems who also need the green skills from a very young and fine age. And then this brings me to the 4th committee, which is the monitoring, evaluation, and learning committee, which would play a crucial role in setting up green standards to avoid the greenwashing when it comes to a lot of projects that we're seeing right now, as well as to report on the impact of the platform on a quarterly basis. This brings me to the 5th committee, which is the auditing committee. And this is going to be to have like a consultative role, because at the end of the day, we need to avoid corruption. We need to avoid also conflicts of interest, in addition to complacency, because we have a lot of amazing platforms who gone wrong because of corruption or complacency, because there's no follow-ups or proper accountability mechanisms. And last but not least, possibly one of the most important committees is the Treasury Committee, because if there's no finance for such platform, then it might crash and burn. So it will be handling the finances as well as the remuneration of the different participants of the platform. And now you might be thinking, who would be the stakeholders of the committee? And like I've mentioned, there are many, but if I, you know, do the normal stakeholder mapping of interest and influence, we have the ministries who have a lot of power and a lot of interest, these ministries. And then we also have green businesses, women groups, feminists, people of disabilities who also have a lot of influence, but maybe the interest, but the influence varies depending on, the country, the context, so on and so forth. And then we have also the brown economy piece who prove like a very, very, a struggle to us and an obstacle to to such a platform to thrive, but also they're very important to be involved in such a platform. And regular civilians whose interests also would vary depending on their involvement. So how will this excessively idealistic idea come to life? Well, I believe 4 key pillars are needed. First is funding. Second is an inclusive governing body for such a platform, and then incentives, as well as a concrete timeline with milestones. So regarding the funding, I try to diversify it in order to avoid, like I've mentioned, too much power in one entity's hands. So this way, if these entities withdraw the funding, then the platform will collapse, or it would put too much funding to promote for the projects that they want. So I divided it between the ministries as well as the private sector, and left 30% for grants and donations. And I felt like donations need to be anonymous also to avoid the corruption or conflict of interest issue. And why would these people commit? When it comes to governments, they have NDCs, even if they don't believe in it wholeheartedly. There is, financial and economic sense that comes out behind this platform, as well as the picture or the image that they portray to the outside world through the NDCs and their achievement. And then the private sector, it could be easily integrated in the CSR scheme, where they can, have taxes or subsidies because they are being more involved in such a platform. And then the youth groups and CSOs, first and foremost, is obviously a platform that they're lacking, as well as incentives where remuneration would be given to young people, as well as other key players in this platform who would be taking part in research, policy creation, so on and so forth. So who will govern the platform? I would propose that it's 15 to 20 elected members from the different stakeholders that I've mentioned previously. They would be kind of like a national steering committee that is representative of as much stakeholders as possible. And then these steering committees will be setting up local chapters, starting with 2 local chapters and then piloting and seeing how we can, move on from that. And the key milestones for me is the creation of the steering committee, and then the creation of the local chapters, and after that having a report, the projects obviously, and then the report, and hopefully a conference or kind of a symposium to help people understand the impact of such a platform. And then maybe an institutionalization in the government could be a good idea. It might not be, but we will see about that. But to ensure that this platform, stays alive. And obviously, this platform does not come without weaknesses. Yes, it does have weaknesses. It does have its strength as well as threats. So when it comes to the strength, obviously, diversity of the stakeholders there, the scalability of the idea is there, diverse funding sources and inclusion. But also we have the weaknesses relating to the commitment of the people, because you never also assure 100% the commitment. Funding sustainability could also be an issue, because just having diverse sources of funding, that doesn't mean that the sustainability will maintain. But I hope that maybe with the creation of impactful projects, some of these projects could fill into the finance of the platform. And then the opportunities, obviously, the NDCs, international conferences, and the focus of the global community right now on the issue of climate crisis. But obviously we have the threats of oil lobbyists, inflation, and obviously also the ongoing wars take precedence, and obviously it depends on the framing of how we can tackle this kind of issue in tandem with the climate crisis, because they're all connected. So yeah, this is the platform, and I believe that together we could really find a common language and common ground for taking action, as well as to get over the frustration of feeling like old people are invading our space or other people are invading our space, because actually they were once the young people who didn't have that space. So to be able to move forward, we need to move forward together, and to believe that this is not an ideal but a reality. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry for taking, I think, very long.
Thank you so much for that well-rounded presentation, Noah. Dr. Kaboub, any comments or questions?
Well, thank you, Noor, for this very clear and thoughtful presentation. Very well structured platform that has all the components that you need for participatory democracy to really kick in and produce the kind of results that we need on the climate front. The challenge, as you know, is the actual activation of these platforms, and that activation requires political will. And national and international level, which we get in, but we don't in action. And then the financing, the funding. And that is true both for the government sector, for the private sector, but especially the counterfunding that goes towards the false solutions and the distractions, primarily from the fossil fuel industry. So I'll zoom in a little bit my comments on that, especially because, again, in Africa, our biggest potential is the renewable energy sector, not the fossil fuel sector. And yet we see not only national governments, signing more deals, but also fossil fuel companies coming in and sort of hijacking the climate narrative to their advantage. They go to a country and say, look, you didn't cause climate change. You're a sovereign country. You have the right to development. And we're going to help you extract the oil and gas to we need to push, because this is really a narrative argument, because we're not saying we need to be anti-development, anti-job creation. If anything, our biggest potential for development, for job creation, is in the renewable sector. So if we take the economics seriously, and if we do due diligence like we're supposed to with every project, and we're supposed to assess the risk, right? And the science is very clear, the economics is very clear. According to the International Energy Agency forecast, global demand for fossil fuels is stalling and is going to decline. And every dollar we invest in fossil fuel infrastructure today on the continent is supposed to produce infrastructure that will be productive and profitable over the next 30 to 50 years, not just the next 10, 20 years. So investors who are putting money on the table, they expect due diligence from the process. And what we're essentially doing is essentially saying, you're investing in potentially stranded assets, physical stranded assets and financial stranded assets. And if we take that point very seriously, then we're actually committing fraud by duping investors into putting money into stranded assets. And fraud is a serious crime that should be paid attention to. So the potential of renewable energy is undeniable. And yet we put it side by side with the fossil fuel industry investments, and we're effectively committing a financial fraud. And that needs to be part of the starting point of the conversation. Unfortunately, with what we've seen in the last few years, especially after the conflict in Ukraine, this dash for gas and dash for fossil fuel investments in Africa in particular, to deal with Europe's energy crisis, right? Because yeah, it was an energy crisis when the conflict started in Ukraine, but not recognizing that Africa has been in an energy crisis for decades. Nobody paid attention. With our potential for renewable energy investment is the largest on the planet. So these are the kinds of questions that create that obstacle for these platforms to really reach their full potential. And really, as I said earlier, you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally decolonized yet. Similarly, you can say you can't democratize a system that hasn't been structurally decolonized yet, because these extractive structures are colonial structures. And our governments, when it comes to the funding, because we do have potentially the fiscal capacity to fund a lot of this stuff domestically, except our priority is always to pay the debt. Our priority is to buy the food that we need to import. So going back to the structural issues that I mentioned earlier. So when you can have the best constitution, the most democratically, the most democratic government in office, but their economy is steered from abroad. The pressures is to prioritize debt payment rather than prioritize funding the climate action and the transformation that we need. So again, getting the structures right is important, but getting the politics and the economics right and the reality of these historic structures is also part of the challenges that we're facing. Thank you again for wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for those comments. Last but not least, we got Sufyan Hatia. who will present his policy on green bonds as a method of paying for the just transition. Over to you, Seth.
Good day, everyone. My name is Sufyan, and I'm honored to discuss my policy solution for the just green transition. I've decided not to use a PowerPoint today because I don't want to bombard you with statistics and acronyms, and due to brevity, I would like to make it more personal and interactive. Climate change is a significant global threat, evident through rising sea levels, extreme weather, and shifting agriculture patterns. To address this, we need solutions that are both effective and also inclusive, as Fadil has pointed out. In our profit-driven society, activists for just green transitions are consistently asked who's going to pay for it. My solution aims to answer this question through green bonds within an equity framework. My proposal focuses on creating a localized funding system for environmentally friendly projects in at-risk areas, ensuring that no community is left behind, whether this includes women, children, minorities, etc., people with disabilities. As Fadil said, often our solutions are reliant on measures within the capitalist system, which is part of the colonial process, the extractive economy in Africa. So my proposal is to aim to work within the system to provide self-sustainability, to make it profitable for businesses to make Africa self-sustainable in essence. My proposal aims to take influence from the successes of the Asian tiger economies in the past, the 70s and the 80s, like Korea, Singapore, and even the success of China, who worked within the capitalist framework and essentially are more self-sufficient now. Of course, there's issues within the country itself, but it's a good framework to take influence from. So explaining green bonds are financial investments that fund projects with positive environmental impacts. When individuals or groups purchase green bonds, they lend money to governments, organizations, or companies to support green initiatives. These bonds function similar to traditional bonds, but the funds are raised solely for environmentally sustainable projects, and investors earn returns through interest payments. How would these bonds be issued? The transition bonds will be issued by a coalition of international financial institutions, governments, and private investors. Unfortunately, we have to rely on the devil or the oppressor to get the money from them. These bonds will specifically fund projects that promote reforestation, water conservation, and sustainable agriculture in Africa and Asia. To propel investment, high interest rates will be offered if projects prioritize local employment and community collaboration. This is vital. We have to have local employment and community collaboration. As we said, our aim is not to come here as men with suits, as colonizers. This is for the people. We can work with United Nations Environmental Programme, United Nations Development Programme, etc., and independent committees, etc., to monitor fund usage and to ensure transparency and to prevent corruption. Our equity framework. The equity framework ensures that the green transition bonds benefit local communities inclusively. It mandates local stakeholder involvement in planning and executing projects, aligning them with community needs and increasing local ownership. Special emphasis will be placed on engaging women, who play a crucial role in promoting sustainable practices. We'll collaborate with state governments to guarantee security, while NGOs can fund training, schooling, and provide aid. So we don't rely completely on NGOs. We don't just give aid, we give industry and the potential for self-sustainable improvement. And comprehensive training programs will equip local workers and businesses with skills needed for the projects. So I've chosen a few implementation regions after some research. We propose implementing these initiatives within Botswana, Ghana, parts of southern Nigeria, and parts of Pakistan. And all of these are selected for their stability and also their role and how they're influenced negatively by the climate crisis. For example, Botswana is stable and democratic. Ghana and southern Nigeria are relatively safe compared to northern Nigeria. Northern Nigeria is facing more militancy right now, but of course, when these areas become more stable, these projects can lead to nationwide implementation. In Pakistan, these projects were based in Punjab and Sindh, which are more stable than Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, who are going through insurgencies at the moment. It is vital to take note and to make note that insurgencies and militant insecurity, like is present in many global south countries, unfortunately. So implementation and maintenance. Implementing and maintaining green transition bonds requires a coordinated effort, a coalition of international institutions, and we have to ensure financial transparency. Private sector partners will provide investment and technical expertise, and this technical expertise will come from them, but eventually, through my equity framework, is meant to be taken by the locals, taken by the people from Nigeria, the youth from Nigeria, the youth from Botswana, the youth from Pakistan, and make it self-sustainable. And community representatives and local governments will engage stakeholders and oversee local implementation to ensure tangible community benefits. So of course, we have quite a few challenges. Securing sufficient funding can be difficult. Investors may be wary of financial risk and regional instability. Political instability and regulatory hurdles in target regions could lead to delays or project cancellations. It's like trying to build a sandcastle during high tide. The conditions need to be just right. Additionally, some areas may lack necessary infrastructure expertise to implement green technologies efficiently. So measuring success. Success will be measured by environmental impact and native economic growth. For example, over a 5-year period, what percentage of Nigeria's machines and agricultural growth is used within Nigeria and not exported? And long-term scalability. To ensure long-term scalability of projects, we assess for the potential to expand or be replicated in other regions. This involves evaluating local adaptations and developing universal sustainability metrics in collaborations with leading financial standard organizations. Will initiate cross-sector collaboration and host roundtable discussions to harmonize approaches. Given that this is a Chatham House event, for example, we can use Chatham House to disseminate research and have articles on this and actually reach out to other potential investors. Well, and to conclude, while implementing green transition bonds presents many challenges, our comprehensive approach addresses these issues head-on by fostering robust international collaboration, ensuring strong governance, and emphasizing community involvement, specifically women's critical roles. We can mitigate these barriers. Women play a pivotal role in promoting sustainable practices and building community resilience. Our initiative aims to create a scalable, sustainable, and inclusive model for green development, benefiting communities worldwide. Together, we can ensure a just green transition that leaves no one behind and isn't reliant on an extractive neo-colonial system. And we secure a resilient future for our planet. As Nelson Mandela wisely stated, it almost seems impossible until it's done. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sufyan. Dr. Kabu, any comments, questions?
Thank you, Sufyan, for a wonderful presentation and for a very clear expose of what green bonds and green finance can really do to unleash the type of funding in the right direction, and to really leverage the incentive structures of the existing financial system to nudge it in the right direction. And as you know, many countries have been going through the process of trying to define what is actually green, right? And I spoke earlier about the idea of financial fraud, right? If we define a particular product that is associated with a particular project as green, then we want to ensure that it is actually green. But green, not just in the sense that it's producing zero emissions or reducing emissions, or it's producing green electricity, but it's also green in the broader ESG sense of the term. Is it extractive? Is it creating further economic entrapment for a particular country? That is the part that unfortunately not a lot of people are paying attention to. And I'll give you an example. So let's say we have green investment, say in the green industrial zone in Namibia, which is one of the biggest, the poster child of green industrialization, which is, major investment primarily from Germany to build green electricity infrastructure, primarily green hydrogen, to fuel green electricity into that green industrial zone for manufacturing. Sounds great, except Namibia doesn't really have any water to spare for producing green hydrogen. We say, no problem, we have the ocean. We can do seawater desalination. Now, seawater desalination is very energy intensive, requires a lot of solar and wind, which require massive land use, right? Is that still green? You can say, okay, it's green. Well, what do we do with the salt brine? That is the byproduct of the desalination. It's typically dumped back in the ocean and has severe long-term consequences on marine life. It increases the salinity of the ocean, which increases the warming and kills the ecosystem over time. Now, is that still green? We can say still green electricity. Okay, so now we're manufacturing stuff with that green electricity. What are we manufacturing? Are we truly industrializing Namibia to escape the bottom of the global value chain? Or are we simply outsourcing obsolete assembly line manufacturing from Europe to be assembled with low-cost labor, with low-cost energy? Is that still green? Well, according to CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, essentially the carbon tax that the European Union is imposing, it's still green. So those green products that are assembled in that green industrial zone are now sold in European markets without paying the CBAM tax. So it turns out to be that this green industrialization is actually an inflation management tool for the European Union. Is that still green? It is still green, right? And it turns out also that the CBAM tax and this green industrialization that is happening in Africa is a trade weapon against Europe's competitors who, if they don't have access to a green industrial zone, they have to pay the CBAM tax. Does that still make it green? Well, according to the standards that we're looking at today, it's still green. But I have very serious reservations about what we call green. So I urge all of us in the climate finance space to really push hard for a very thorough and a just transition type of definition of what is green financial instrument, so that when we unleash the potential of the private sector into this area, we know that it's actually producing the transformation that we need. But so it's a whole spectrum of what we can define as green bonds. There's the narrow definition is just producing green electricity. That's good, qualifies, versus everything else. And it's important not only because of the particular product that we call green bonds, but because of the potential that we can unleash from banks. As you know, there's an organization that was started almost a decade ago now called the Network for Greening the Financial System. That's the full name, but the acronym is the NGFS, Network for Greening the Financial System. And it's a wide spectrum of ideas of how do we green the financial system, including green bonds, and of course, but one of the biggest kind of leverage that we could have once we define what is actually green is changing the capital adequacy requirement for banks from the existing one, which is, everything is included, to segregating, saying this capital requirement is for green assets and this capital requirement is for non-green assets. And once you do that, you lower the capital adequacy requirement on green assets. Once we define what is green, then you immediately unleash the incentive for banks to move further into decarbonizing their balance sheet and decarbonizing their lending and their investments. And that unleashes further potential. And again, we need otherwise sort of a Minsky moment of false decarbonization by creating massive financial risks on their balance sheets. So the devil is in the detail in every aspect of climate finance, specifically when it comes to defining what is green in the best sense of the term, because we want to accelerate this transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kaboub and Sufyan. So we've got time for about 2 questions. So I'd love if anybody could raise their hand. We can unmute you to ask your questions. Otherwise, we'll go to some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A. Cool. Yeah, Nada, you should be able to unmute.
All right, thanks a lot for this very insightful discussion, be it by the CFC members or by Dr. Kaboub. It's truly insightful, is the understatement of the century. I have multiple questions, but being mindful of the time, maybe I'm gonna ask one of them. You mentioned in the beginning of the session that basically the green solutions or green financial tools that are being most promoted on the scene was concerning carbon market, and it's basically not the best solution when it comes to the different stakeholders, and it's basically greenwashing. So from that, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the ideal financial tool that will be just for the countries from the South? And maybe another very small question. How do you see the role of youth when it comes to holding governments accountable to the different finances that reach the countries? Because a big premise upon which the global North state that climate finance are not as big to the global South because of the issue of corruption, especially in the Middle East. Yes, these are my small questions, and maybe I'll email you the rest.
Thank you. Ashton, do you want me to respond immediately?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Nada, for your questions and comments. I'll put it this way, just so that we're brief. And I posted a link to my blog, and I answer a lot of these questions and discuss, carbon markets and what we should be calling pollution permits rather than carbon credits. But essentially, as I said earlier, we have a climate debt problem here. And if I owe you a debt, like if I owe you $100, I'm supposed to pay you, right? I don't think it's debatable, right? But instead, here's what's happening in the climate finance space. Instead of paying you the $100 that I owe you, I'm going to give you $3 and tell you exactly what to do with it, to continue the entrapment. And then I feel really bad because you clearly need more climate finance than those $3. So I'm going to lend you $7 at concessional rates, noblesse oblige. And again, tell you exactly what to do with those $7. And then I feel bad, you really need more climate finance. So I say, well, I'm going to give you another $10, but you really have to give me your forest for carbon credits, for pollution permits. And then I say, well, you clearly need me even more climate finance to accelerate this just transition. So I'm going to invest another $20 in your economy, but you have to produce green hydrogen for me, right? For my economy, not for your economy. And you have to de-risk it to guarantee my, the profitability of my investment. And I'm looking at this and say, wait a minute, you owe me $100. I'm not supposed to give you anything. I'm not to give you my forest, my hydrogen. So we have to completely reset the conversation about this thing we call climate finance. And as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement once said, he said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism and false solutions and these dangerous distractions. And I think for us as Africans and pushing our governments to stop taking these crumbs, to stop walking into these traps and call it out and say, we're not going to negotiate on climate, on anything, unless we reset the conversation about how climate finance works. Is it going to be further entrapment, sort of greenwash, rinse and repeat of the old relationships, economic relationship, or is it not? And to go back to your comment, Nada, about corruption, yeah, corruption is part of the problem. And the fact that we're in a debt trap, continuously in a debt trap, means that the negotiation capacity of our government is very, very limited. And I think that's really part of the struggle, that we have governments who are willing to accept these financial crumbs, these false solutions, these distractions, because they need to pay for the wheat shipment that's waiting at the port. And so the debt is part of this this entrapment that I described earlier. And when it comes to the role of the national financial institutions that really continuous IMF and World Bank program for decades, with these institutions literally dictating your domestic economic policy. The fact that we're in a debt trap means one of two things. It's either that these institutions are incompetent and we should not take economic policy advice from them anymore, or that this is intentional entrapment that is part of the continuation of this hierarchical relationship that we have in the global economy. And I think it's the latter. And we need to call this out. But instead, we're handing out, climate finance infrastructure to the World Bank to manage the loss and damage fund and to channel, supposedly climate finance for transformation. It hasn't happened in the past. Why should we expect it to happen moving forward if the economic model that the World Bank still continues to perpetuate is part of that entrapment? So thank you again for your questions.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. And then maybe just to wrap up, Ika, are you there to ask your question from the Q&A?
Hi, thank you very much. Very insightful presentation from our speaker. So to cut to the chase, my question was with regards to the issue of the systemic problem of extractivism, to what extent can the colonial legacy, Europe's colonial legacy, hinder the ability of African and European nations to achieve a just green transition? And how can historical and present issues which exist between the two continents be addressed to foster and harness multilateralism rooted in the overarching principles of justice to achieve a issue of new and how transitions
Ashton, do you want me to go ahead and answer?
To perpetuate new colonialism? Thank you. So that's my question.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you. So very good question, Ika. Thank you for your question and for your intervention. I'll give you an example because when we say extractivism, we tend to think of mining and extracting resources, but extractivism is much broader than that. I use the term even in terms of extraction agricultural resources. I'll give you an example. When the Ukraine conflict happened and we had this disruption of shipping of grains, especially from Russia and Ukraine, we discovered finally, the majority of people discovered that this thing we call food security is actually a loaded technical term that's been pushed on the African continent in particular. Now, who doesn't like food security? It sounds great in the colloquial sense of the term, except it's a technical term that says food security means you secure the nutrition of your people, either by producing the food or by buying it or by borrowing money to buy it from abroad, which is what we typically do, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your agriculture, to your farmers, right? Because they can't compete with free food imported from abroad. So during colonial times, we used to be the breadbasket producing the wheat and corn and soybean and barley and rice for ourselves and for the rest of the world, for colonial powers. But as soon as we started to gain independence, it started with the meeting in 1955, the Treaty of Rome, where European powers basically said, we have a food security problem on this continent and Europe. And that needs to change because they became clearly very dependent on the former colonies who are now becoming independent. So that started a series of conversations, eventually introduced the European Union Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is in place to this day. It's a core pillar of the European Union. And that meant our farmers couldn't compete with the cheaper wheat and rice and corn coming from Europe. But of course, it's not just Europe, because the US was doing the same, Canada, Japan, Australia, and the former Soviet Union. That is why Russia and Ukraine dominate the grain industry. So that redesign of the global food system that forced us into producing cash crops for exports, to be dependent completely on core crops produced in the global north, that is part of the colonial and post-colonial structure that keeps us food dependent, food insecure, and keeps us in debt. So if we have an honest conversation today with our partners in the global north, saying, look, this is a climate issue, this is a food security issue, this is a hunger issue, how to rebalance the global food system in a way that allows us to have the equivalent of the European Union Common Agricultural Policy on the African continent. And that will reduce emissions, that will reduce shipping, that will restore the quality of the soil. And that's why I talk about, food sovereignty and agroecology is not the same thing as food security. And when it comes to, for example, what the French Ministry of Agriculture, if you look at the building, the sign on their website, it says the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty, not food security. But every time we talk about food issue in the African, not the same thing. And once we decolonize that conversation, then we can start talking about, well, how can we rebalance the global food system and move forward under a just transition framework? So hopefully that's a useful example. Thank you.
Ricard, did you have a quick follow-up on that before we wrap up?
Yes, thank you. A quick follow-up to Mr. Kabout's delivery. Considering again that Africa is the most sanctioned continent in the world, how can we possibly address the issue of say decolonizing topics as food sovereignty, or dealing with issues like food security issues or other aspects of the transition, when we are dealing with a debt trap? We are the most sanctioned continent in the world, and people are not ready or willing to have these honest conversations. And we also see that backlash from African countries also trying to achieve the total sovereignty in this 21st century, with the issue of neocolonialism. So yeah, that's a follow-up to what you just said. Thank you.
Very, very good question. So the first thing is that no African country can do this alone. We have to do this as regional blocks or as a continent. And that is unfortunately part of the problem that we have, is that we think we can fix these problems at the national level, because the strength of the European agricultural system is not because France did it alone and Germany did it alone and the rest did it alone. It's because they sat down and negotiated a common agricultural policy. and they committed to it with long-term fund and political commitment. Governments come and go, right wing, center wing, left wing, the common agriculture that we need to have on the continent. So when we talk about Pan-African unity and Pan-African cooperation, it's not a nice fluffy thing we say each other in Addis once a year when we have the African Union Summit. We need to recognize that this is an economic and geopolitical necessity. It's not because we like each other that we cooperate, it's because we have to, because nobody can get out of these traps alone. I hope it.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Kaboub, and thank you so much both for your time and for your contributions today. Also, thank you to our three CFC panelists, Sufyan, Daniel, and Noah, for your contributions and for your policy ideas. And thank you to everybody who attended today. I hope that everybody has a great evening.